Night pressed a smudged thumb across the city, and all the candles seemed to draw in their light, as though breathing shallowly so as not to be heard. In the Queen's solar, the shutters were open to the whisper of the river and the steady sea breath from the bay. The air that came in smelled of tar and salt, and underneath, faint as a confession, smoke. Cersei sat with her wine untouched. The goblet turned between her fingers so that the rubies in the stem winked and went dark with each rotation. She had not lit a fire in the brazier, though the night had a chill to it. She preferred the colder honesty of it. The hearth always made a room feel occupied, and tonight she wanted the space to feel hollow enough that any stray thought would clap and echo. The sound of boots came and went in the corridors beyond, the shudder of a drawn latch, the brush of a skirt. The castle was a hive at night, with its own industry of whispers and errands. If the Red Keep slept, it only ever slept with one eye. She could feel it attend to her, the way a beast will flick an ear toward a fly. On the table before her lay a folded scrap of parchment, sealed and broken. The word beneath the seal had been short and of the sort men use when they think they are saying something clever, something difficult. The word was unfinished. She had seen it there and smiled, that thin smile that had once convinced half a court she was pleased. Unfinished, as though wars were tapestry work and the only problem was more hours at the loom. As though men did not unravel faster than thread. The night wind brought a muted clamor up from the city. Dockside laughter, iron ringing iron, a mule's obstinate complaint, a distant song in which the singer had forgotten the words halfway through and filled the gaps with feeling. Elsewhere, somewhere low and many-storied, a baby cried, found no answer, and settled into the rhythmic hiccup of despair. "Your Grace," said the maid at the door, breathless as a runner. "Grand Maester Pycelle." The old man shuffled in, wearing the expression of an indulgent grandfather who finds the children have built some ruinous fort of chairs. His chains breathed softly against his chest. "I have done as your Grace commanded," he said, almost to his feet. "And the pyromancers are amenable." "Amenable," she said, tasting the word. "I had hoped for obedient." "They are a proud guild," Pycelle murmured. "They were esteemed once beyond their due. They have waited long for a return to favor and power. They will have both if they serve quickly." She let the goblet rest. "Bring him." He bowed and backed out. She watched the doorway for the brief reflection of torchlight on oil, and then Haleen of the Alchemists' Guild came in as though he were stepping into an old lover's house, half reverence, half ownership. He had the inward tilted look of men who have spent too long at their own work, the notion that anything beyond the edge of the table is not quite real. The green glass vial he carried was small as a child's toy, yet impossible not to see. "Your Grace," he intoned, "a wondrous evening. Wondrous. The air has a certain dryness, a stillness. Matters ignite better when the world holds its breath." His words had the texture of velvet turned the wrong way. Cersei's hand drifted to the table's edge. She did not touch the vial. There was a faint smell clinging to Haleen's clothes that did not belong in rooms or in the company of people. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, just wrong sweetness ruined by metal. "I asked what you can do," she said. "I know what your order dreams of doing. Tell me what you can do." He cradled the vial and smiled with a craftsman's zeal. "Our substance is not fire. It is not simple burning. It is appetite. It is hunger," Cersei said. "Spare me your poetry. It answers flame with more flame." He adjusted, chastened, delighted nonetheless to be saying the words. "The city," he caught himself. "Certain locales in the city hold the old pots, still sealed." The Hill of Rainies was seated most liberally. Again that smile, like a child with a secret place to hide his sweets. Cersei looked toward the window. In the wind you could sometimes hear bells, not because they were ringing but because they wanted to be rung. Her mouth felt dry. "Do we have them, these locales?" He inclined his head. "The capriciousness of record-keeping is a form of test the gods inflict upon diligent men. Fortunately, our predecessors were devout. We have maps. We have the old ledgers. In some cases, long quiet brethren have guided us through their notes. And the city watch?" Haleen's eyes, very dark, shone with a light from nowhere. The watch will stay out of our way if they wish to keep their hands attached to their arms. The vials do not like drops or jostling. Pycelle coughed, as if there were words stuck in his throat and he was reluctant to let them escape. Your Grace, there is the matter of rumor. Workmen talk when employed, and the guild has members who enjoy the sound of their own learning. Then we need no more of them than necessary, Cersei said. And we need them quickly. She stood. The night, hard and cool, pressed itself against her face. She contemplated the dark city and imagined it reversed, the dark water and the bright land. I will keep my children in the holdfast. I will tell the king it is for. She paused, and let her mouth shape the lie before she spoke it. The lie like a pebble turned smooth by years, a lie she could hold without being burned. For safety while we cleanse the city of rats. The stench of treason is high. Even birds can smell it. Helene made a swallowing sound. It might have been reverence. Your Grace is a worthy inheritor of great designs. Inheritance, she said, finally looking at him as if to challenge even his praiseful trembling, is for those who are given things. Do your part. When they were gone, Cersei lifted the gob. The wine had the heavy look of blood in a cup. She drank and did not taste it. The old hatred rose at the smell of the wine. Memories she always thought she had caged. The memory of her father's stillness, like a statue that knew it could move whenever it liked. Of her husband's laugh, which always sounded as if he were mocking someone even when he was only drunk. She thought of a girl with straw in her hair who had told her her children would wear crowns of gold and then their shrouds would be made of the same. She had never decided whether the cruelty of prophecy lay in its truth or in its ability to make people destroy themselves trying to avoid it. The youngest came to her then, Tommen with the soft face that would never harden if she had anything to do with it, Myrcella with her quiet questions, and Joff, no, the king, whose mouth had acquired an old man's sneer. She would save what could be saved. The rest would learn. A small noise moved in the lintel. Varys appeared as if the air had drawn him, his presence slipping between the pillars. He offered one of those delicate bows that managed to apologize without conceding anything. Your Grace, he said, there is a stirring in places that ought to be still. I thought you would wish to know. What would you have me do? She said. If I did not already know. He had the grace not to pretend surprise. He looked at the wine, at the unlit brazier, at the open shutters, and saw in these things a story. The city is a tinderbox, he said softly, as if cautioning her about a glass figurine in a child's hand. Do you mean to teach it fire, Your Grace? I mean to remind it who holds the flint, she said. Go and be useful, Lord Varys. I expect you know precisely where to be when heat rises. He regarded her for a moment, and his eyes, those flat, clever gardens in which no flower was visible, only each petal's calculation, warmed by a degree too slight to measure. He bowed again and departed with a sigh of silk that carried with it the faint sweetness of the oils he wore. For a long time after he left, the scent lingered, and Cersei could not decide whether it was worse than the alchemist's wrong sugar metal smell. She did not sleep. Instead, she followed the familiar grooves of the castle, her steps a map, down to the holdfast to where her children were. She let herself look at them while they slept, one in a heap of limbs as if wrestling with an invisible bear, one curled small as a thought, one sprawled with the knobby gracelessness of a youth trying to be grown. She touched their hair with a hand that did not tremble and left before she could be tempted to wake them. In the corridor, she stood very still with her eyes closed until her breath came without hitching. When dawn came, it was the sallow, weary dawn of a day that has already decided it will not be beautiful to anyone. The city below yawned its markets open. Men lifted the shutters of their stalls with the complaint of wood on wood. Fishmongers impersonated the sea at the top of their lungs. A boy ran with a basket and fell and did not cry, only got to his feet and glanced once at the sky as if it had tripped him. It looked the way wakefulness looks when the night has not been kind. Janos Slint stood at the head of a file of gold cloaks and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and tried to arrange his face into his superior expression. He did this by imagining the men before him smaller than they were, and then imagining himself larger than he was, and then believing both. "You," he said, pointing to a pair of watchmen who had not bothered to snap to even when he approached. "Take the Tin Street patrol. You double it. I want eyes on any man with more than one sword in his house. You find casks where casks should not be. You take none of it for yourself. If I hear you have, I will have you piss out your last drink by way of your throat." The men laughed because they were supposed to. Janos held back his own smile until they had gone. Then he put his hand inside his jerkin and touched the weight of the little lion-sealed parchment at his breast, as though it would whisper instructions through his skin. It did not. He had read it twice and he'd needed too long on some of the words. "Withdraw your men," it had said, "from Low Lantern and from the steps of Balers, and if the alchemists request passage, you will provide it. Withdraw your men." It was the sort of order that made him itch, because it put him in the position of a man holding a door open not knowing who was going to walk through it. But the little red seal had been pressed by the Queen's ring, and he was not an idiot. "Sir," said a watchman, young enough that his beard was an idea. "There's talk that the king wants to see the heads mounted higher. He feels the birds rest on them too easily. He thinks it appears disrespectful." Janos considered the heads along the walls. They had never been friends to him alive, and they did not look less likely to ask for coin now. "If the king wishes to see his commands carried out," he said, "he can send me commands. Not the talk of boys whose mothers still call them duckling." Then, remembering, he softened his voice by a hair and clapped the boy on the shoulder. "Go on, run along, and keep your eyes off the ground. Pride's in the chin." In Flea Bottom, a woman with flour still dusting her forearms purchased an onion that had the runched face of a man considering whether to speak. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve and pointed to a puppeteer reenacting the king's justice on a rag-stuffed trader. The puppet squeaked. Then one caught fire and the crowd roared laughter at the puppeteer's hissed consternation. "Meant to do it," the man announced. "Justice burns bright." The fire took to the rag finger the trader had been pointing with, and the crowd liked that even better. The woman with the flour-dusted arms bought 2 eggs she could not afford because her daughter was watching in tea. The girl's mouth was hopeful. Sandor Clegane stalked the inner yard with his shoulders carrying his head forward as if he were ready to bite. The early morning had found him sober through no fault of his own. The castle was full of the scent of hot iron and horse and men's unwashed bravado. It all made him feel, as it always did, inside his own skin the wrong way. He paused at the well and drank as if he were trying to drown something inside. It was his habit to look at the baker's boy coming through the yard. It reminded him that people could move lightly even if they had to carry things and had no business moving lightly. Today, the boy was missing. No, that was wrong. The boy was someone else now, a wider-shouldered page in a tunic too fine for him, and Sandor had mixed their shapes up for a moment. He put the back of his burned hand to his mouth and pressed until the pain ironed everything else. Sansa stepped into the yard with 2 ladies trailing her like commas. For pause, for propriety. The yard loved the sight of her because she made it feel like a story. She hated herself for liking that, but there it was, she did. She held herself as she'd been taught and smiled when someone looked as though a smile could save them. Her gown was blue and had the look of sky in it, and she wished she did not have to think that, and then she found herself thinking it anyway because her thoughts always arrive the way wine does down a tired man's throat. Easily, even if you do not want them. She thought about lemon cakes because thinking about lemon cakes was a way of not thinking about heads on spikes. Sandor saw the girl's mouth form something too like prayers and felt irritated with her and protective of her, and then irritated with himself for the latter. He pushed away from the well. "Little bird," he said. "You look as if you're about to say something the gods might like to hear. Best keep that sort of thing to your September. The yard hasn't the patience for piety." She lowered her eyes because the gesture had once made her feel soft and safe. "Ser Sande." "Not a Ser," he said, automatic and tired. "And if you call me Ser again, I'll have your tongue and send it to the kitchens to be spitted. There are men there who can make a meal of anything." She did not flinch. It was the only trick she had learned well. "It is a fine morning," she said, and then could not stop herself, adding, "though the air smells strange." "Rot," Sandor said. "Rot and rain and men. That's every morning." Go on and be fine." After she had passed, he turned his face to the sun as if offering it to a blade. The warmth did not move far into him. He would drink later and it would not touch him either. In the undercellars beneath the alchemist's guild hall, Helene moved like a priest in a sacred grove. His acolytes were careful because they were cowards, and his masters were careful because they were clever, and the substance required both. The room's heart was the row on row of green jars that reflected their faces distorted, as if the glass were seeing what it wished to see rather than what it was offered. The jars had the pleased aspect that jars do when they sense they will be asked to fulfill their purpose. Helene spoke softly to a scribe. "The order of placement will be as discussed. Sewers branching toward Rainey's Hill, drainage tunnels beneath Baylor's statue, the vaults under the fishmonger's stalls at the edge of the Street of Flower." His finger traced the map as if the line itself made the tunnels. The scribe licked his pencil. "And the great September? We will not lay pots beneath the sept itself," Helene said, and the scribe looked disappointed. "We will lay them where the heat will be drawn to it, as a husband to his bride. The heat will make the stones sing. It will be instructive." The men moving the jars were instructed not to look them in the eye. One did and could not help doing it twice. He thought he saw the fire inside blink. He told himself he was a man grown and not a girl made to cry by a shadow, and the thing inside the jar tightened like a muscle. Varys crossed the cellars of the red keep like a whisper going downhill. He paused at the mouth of a tunnel where even air did not dare go without asking. A boy with no name came to him from an opening that was not there and stood with a look that said he knew he existed because someone had told him so, and he did not entirely believe it. Varys pressed a coin into his hand. "Find the woman who lost her son to the Watch's culling," he murmured. "She has 3 more. She has refused any place in anyone's floor where she has to sleep. Tell her to go at once to the shipman with the blue sail. There is a place under boards with water barrels for those who do not mind splinters. I will be displeased if she does not arrive." "And if she doesn't want to go?" the boy asked in his own voice. "Tell her the city will become a place to leave," Varys said. "She will understand that better than any reason." He moved on, past walls with secret habits, past stones that remembered being moved. He passed a place where once a man had hidden because he feared being named and then had died because he had not been named quickly enough. He did not linger anywhere too long. He had nothing to confess and did not wish to be tempted. The queen ordered a light breakfast be taken away uneaten. The king demanded to replace his morning of instruction with a morning of archery, and then discovered he did not like archery in the morning because the string stung his fingers in the cool. Myrcella asked in a voice like a thread of gold whether they might go to the gardens, and Cersei said they would stay close today, because sometimes a lioness liked to have her cubs where she could step on anyone reaching for them. Tommen brought his kitten into the solar and sat cross-legged on the floor and kissed it between its ears with a sort of earnest fervor that made Cersei look away. She could not stand the shape of his goodness because it implied a world in which such a thing could survive, and she did not live in such a world. Littlefinger appeared in a wash of evenly distributed charm. He smelled faintly of ink and clean coins. "Your Grace," he said, just the right degree of admiring. "A minute of your morning? Take it," Cersei said, though she knew if she allowed him one, he would set up a shop there. He laid out the day's coins in words, in which the king's debts were a hand that found its own pocket empty and reached into others. "A matter which requires your signature," he said, and she paused long enough to make him wonder whether he was speaking to a wall. "A loan," he added, "from an interested party valuable for political reasons." "Do I appear to you a woman interested in politics?" she asked, "or a queen interested in rule?" He smiled. It was the sort of smile that would be read by a lazy reader as agreement. "I see a woman who knows that politics are knives and rule is how long you keep them clean. Shall I return later with my paper, Your Grace? When your afternoon is less occupied?" Her lip twitched at occupied. "Go," she said, "and do not be where I need to look for you when I do not want to see you." When he had gone, she thought of him leaving with his careful walk, measured but not cautious, as if every step were a joke that he was telling the floor. She had never decided whether it was easier to use him or watch him be useful to himself and call it a favor. As Noon struggled to decide what sort of day it wanted to be, Haleen and his men slid the first lined clay down a hole cut long ago in a shop floor that had since become a tavern, and then a wool merchant's, and then a room where a woman read cards for sailors. The jar kissed the damp air. The scribe wrote on his ledger with the contentment of someone writing the end of a long story before it had truly begun. Two boys from the Street of Sisters, hired cheaply because boys are, carried their jar awkwardly and set it down and stared at something that stared back, and both of them later would insist that it had moved. In the sept, candles made flocks of light on the polished wood of the pews. It was a day that smelled of cassia and old dust and the breath of prayers. An old septon, who had made it his daily practice to look for miracles in small and mean places where nobody else wanted to look, opened his eyes to a feeling in the stone. He bent and put his ear to the floor with the unself-consciousness of a man who has surrendered his dignity for larger things long ago. Somebody came over to ask whether he was ill, and he shook his head. "The city is grumbling," he said. He did not stop to wonder whether he had lost his senses. The floor had spoken to him, that was fact enough for him. He went to take off his robe because in his mind he was already climbing to the roof to look down at the streets, and he did not want to do so in the heavy cloth. The sun scraped itself along the sky. The gulls dived and scolded, and the docks were busy with men who counted someone else's money. The queen had the children eat with her in a small room that looked toward the gardens where the leaves were different types of green with the sort of order people pretend they understand. The king grew bored and slapped the table for more wine. Tommen told his sister in a whisper that his kitten preferred to sleep with its nose under its tail because it was shy. Cersei sent the children back to the holdfast under guard and went to the window and did not look away even when the light grew mean. She had instructed the alchemists as to the hour. It was an hour that felt like a hesitation. Too late for honest things, too early for dangerous things, and therefore precisely the right time for both. She rested her ring hand on the sill, and the stone underneath felt very old and very tired. The first thing was the sound. It was not thunder. It did not roll. It struck. It came up from the stones as a felt thing, through the soles, the bones, the back of the teeth. The sound did not say anything. It was not a voice. It was a hand on a door. Cersei straightened. She saw nothing for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then the corner of a distant street lifted gently as if a giant were curious about what was beneath. The movement was not like fire yet. It was like the city learning to breathe, the slow opening of a stopped mouth. Then color. Not red, not the good honest yellow of hearths, but green. Green like glass when it takes the sun. Green like things that grow too fast and too thick and choke what could have blossomed. It fanned and then gathered as if thinking better of it. A broad tongue licked itself along a street and found the corner of a building and teased at it and then bit. Stone blackened strange under it. Wood did not blacken so much as curl. There was a silence to it that made everything around it louder. The bells began to ring, and their ringing had panic in it now, and dogs began their hysterics and men shouted each other's names wrong. The jars were old and faithful, and every one of them kept the promise that had been pressed into their wax. They did not burst so much as cease to be jars and become mouth. Flame found flame and recognized it as kin. A bridge of light unfurled down a row of open drains where the day's chamber pots had given their offerings, and the drains took it greedily because they were accustomed to carrying away filth, and this was simply another shape of it. A man at a fish stall emptied a pan of water, and it flared with a surprise that made him scream with a kind of betrayal. Heat roared up and cracked a window, and then another. Great Baylor sat with the sun on his brow outside the sept whose bells were named for virtues, and he watched the first of the green fire with the placid focus of a man sculpted to watch. The stone under his feet vibrated and then shuddered and then sang. The song so thin as to be almost pain, and the statue shifted the fraction of an inch a statue can move. A trick of the eye nonsense. People began to run down the steps the way ants run when you stick a branch in their mound to see what matters to them. Cersei watched and then closed the shutters. She did it with no haste. She turned and walked to the door as if she were going to receive a guest. "Ser Boros?" she said to the white cloak who waited there in the uneasy way of a man who smells smoke and does not know whether to be ashamed of fearing it. "You will keep the king with you." If he wishes to stand by a window, you will advise him of the better view to be had from a chair. He stared at her in that manner men have when they suspect a command is more than a command and fear they will not be equal to it. Your Grace. She moved through the corridors with their odd echoes, the whispers of stone referencing itself. In the holdfast Marcella had her hand in Tommen's, and both their faces had the soft look of children who have not yet been given the exact shape of fear to hold. Joffrey was pacing, complaining that the bells made his head ache, and trying to make this a complaint that others should solve to make him feel better. She took his face in her hands with a genuine fondness that came from danger's proximity. Love is simpler when it might have to die. It is nothing, she said. It is only a lesson some are learning. You will not need to learn it. You were born knowing it. What lesson? He demanded, not satisfied by any answer that did not have someone's humiliation in it. Not to play with what is mine, she said. Sit, Yoff. Keep your sister at your side. Sandor found the first edge of the fire in a corridor where it had no business being. It was a sheen along the margin, the way oil looks if you catch it on water, the way a dream looks when you try to remember it. He swore and then realized he had not said the words aloud because the sound had died in the air. He turned to run, and not from anything he would have named, because sometimes a man runs because his body knows the world is wrong. He did not realize he was heading toward the Queen's chambers until he arrived there. Fire, he said, and the word came out as if it had been dragged from him by hooks. Cersei looked at him and saw in him the thing she needed. He was a blade that did not pretend to be anything else. Take the girl, she said, nodding toward Sansa, who shivered in a corner with her thoughts folded around her. If the fire comes to us, you will carry her into the cellars. If the fire does not come to us, you will carry her there anyway. You will wait with her. Sandor's face was a story he did not permit to be told. And the king? He asked. The king is well attended, she said. He made a noise that might have been laughter if laughter had any meat on it. He stooped and grabbed Sansa's arm, not cruelly, but with a grip that did not accept argument. Little bird, he said, we're going to the dark. The dark's better than this light. Sansa's breath came out and went back in like someone else's breath. She put her hand to her throat and discovered her throat still existed, and that made her walk. Behind them, a door thumped and a chain rattled and someone prayed informally. Varys moved through the keep and found a chamber empty except for a chair that had never been sat in because people thought someone else would sit in it, a flagon rolling gently on its side. He listened. The fire had a presence that was not sound. It made the spaces in between everything aware of themselves. He went to a wall and pressed a stone and listened to it decline to move because it was not that stone. He tried again. The panel sighed and he felt for the rope ladder that led down into the long throat of the castle. Janos Slynt stood on the steps of Baelors and realized that withdrawing men from a place did not mean withdrawing himself. He watched the first of the green flame reach as if someone had threaded it with the invisible string of the wind and pulled. He saw people run in patterns that suggested most of them had never been taught how to run away. He shouted orders until he realized he was not saying anything intelligible. He turned to leave and found Haleen standing beside him, his mouth open in a smile that seemed to be coming apart. Marvels, Haleen said softly, and then louder, Marvels! The word contained a child's jump. You did this, Janos said, trying to make his tone the sort that turns what has been done into a thing to be ashamed of. The pyromancer went on smiling. The eyes of the man in the watchman's livery standing behind Janos went wide, and he took a step forward and then back as if the space in front of him had become a precipice. Janos pushed him toward it in lieu of pushing himself. At the fish market, a woman threw a bucket of water out of habit onto something that had not yet burned, and the water hit the ground and rose with a hiss and kissed her face green, and she opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was the sort of sound you only hear when something finds out what it is. A boy of 10 who had never been asked to do anything except get out of the way did not move but stood looking at the fire with a wonder so honest it made a man near him weep. The boy's shadow was wrong. It did not know where to be. It put itself in two places at once and then decided to be everywhere because there was nowhere it could be that the green would not touch. The great September's facade drank heat until it looked intoxicated. The windows began to cough delicately and then break one after another like someone cracking knuckles. 2 of the 7 crystal crowns above the doors melted with the sorrowful grace of wax. The bells, Mother's mercy, Father's judgment, took their panic into their own mouths and clanged until one broke its tongue on air. The old septon climbed to the roof after all, robe forgotten, hair a white frill around his head like foam, and he stepped onto the tiles and regarded a city going from thing made of places into one single place. He wept without hiding the weeping, because he had promised something once to something larger than himself, that he would look at what was before him and not lie about it. In the Red Keep, rushes smoldered and turned into absences. In a hall where noble had danced with noble on a night of wine and plans, a tapestry fluttered and then did not exist. Sansa and Sandor moved into a stair where the air was old and quiet and the walls listened but did not gossip. Sansa took 2 steps like she was taking a test she had not studied for, and then tripped and cut her palm and said sorry to the stair for bleeding in its presence, and Sandor said nothing because he had no words that did not have a growl in them. "Why the cellars?" she asked at last, because her voice was in her throat and might as well do something. "Will it be safe there?" "Safe," Sandor said. "Safe's a word men who haven't had a reason to use it lately say. You go to ground when the sky's angry. Your head is still attached to your neck. That's the best safety you'll see today." "I don't understand," she said. "What is happening? Who would set such a thing?" "Your pretty queen," he said. "Your pretty king's pretty mother." He glanced at her then to see whether the words would carry anything that would break in her. She did not break then because she had become something that did not break easily. She was struggling with the idea of the queen and the idea of fire and how they might be the same thing. Sandor put a hand on her shoulder because it was the thing to do with something you were trying to keep. "You look at me," he said, as if he were instructing her to hold a plank steady while he hammered. "You don't look at the green." They reached a door that had never been opened quickly. It was the sort of door craftsmen love because it means there are things behind it that can be kept. Sandor set his shoulder to it and remembered all at once the feeling of his face as a boy when his brother had pressed it hard against a flame and he saw nothing for a heartbeat except the shape of that day. He closed his eyes and broke the memory by breaking the door. Splinters flew and Sansa made a small sound which was not a scream but related to one. The dark received them. The dark said nothing. Sandor leaned back against the door, breathing the large breaths of a man who has done a thing with his whole body. Cersei's face told itself the story of what was happening beyond the shutters. She could see it in her mind as sharply as if she had painted it on the inside of her lids. She could see the streets becoming lines of light that stitched parts of the city together that had not known each other and would not have wanted to meet. She could see men who had thought themselves brave discovering that bravery without an audience has a different flavor. She could see the sept, and she found that she had no feeling about its fate beyond the satisfaction of seeing it realize it could not intercede between a queen and her will. Myrcella sat very still. Joffrey moved to the window and tried to pull the shutter, and Boros had to place 2 hands on the wood. "It's my city," Joffrey said. "I want to see what it looks like burned." Cersei swiveled to him with a slowness that was like the first part of a slap. "It will not be burned," she said. "It will be taught." He did not understand the difference, and it did not matter to her whether he understood. On the edges of the markets, where cloth dye and fish guts make a constant kind of stink that people accept as air, a man who had lost 2 fingers to a girl's father's rage found a dog snarling at the fire in a way that suggested dogs know the difference between fear and anger. He kneeled in front of it and put his forehead to its forehead and said nonsense to it in the tones you use for lovers or children. The dog butted him and then fled. He went the other way because men always go the other way when a thing that knows the world better than they do moves. Haleen clapped his hands twice and the men with him stopped to listen because they recognized the ceremony in the movement. "Observe," he said to nobody in particular and to anyone who would hear, as if the moment required formal words to be true. "Observe as ignition becomes manifestation." To his left, a boy with a pencil wrote the words down because when men of authority speak, boys with pencils write. Haleen lifted his chin and took the smoke into his lungs and coughed gently into his sleeve and smiled anyway. He thought of the letter he would compose later explaining the marvelous processes to those who had forgotten their own secrets. He did not think of the women whose kitchens he had marked on his maps or of the way small bodies would curl. Varys reached a postern gate and found it jammed with people who had thought themselves first to it. They had become matter there, struggling to become motion. He saw at once that the gate would fail and that before it did the people would. He stepped back before the crowd could make him part of it. He hated certain things. He did not hate himself enough to die the sort of death that required you to be lost inside other people's fear. He found another passage and began to count. He had a map of the city nobody else had because it was drawn on the inside of his mind and it changed when the city changed. He tried to erase a part of it where a street no longer existed. He found he could not yet. Erasing took time. In the Tower of the Hand, which felt lately like a story told about itself because the hand was absent and the tower had only its own tallness. The wind shifted and brought a smell like a glove for the nose. Doors opened and closed and someone shouted across a courtyard a name and got in reply a name that did not belong to him. Two cooks began to throw flour on a fire. The tea had not yet walked into their kitchen because someone had told them flour smothered flame and they wanted to be men who knew what to do when doing mattered. The first of the outer houses around the sept went down with the curious pathos houses have when they fall. The way their rooms are briefly laid like pages so you can see where people lived. The chair still placed at an angle to a window that had once had a view and no longer did, the bedsheets half-jerked story. The wind took ash and placed it carefully on the lips of strangers. A man used a board to beat at the flames and then stopped and dropped the board because the green climbed the wood to his hands faster than boards ought to move. He wrapped his arms around his head and waited for better ideas. Cersei said, almost conversationally, "When this is finished, we will have less city but more peace." The words sat in the room as if they had the right to be there. "We will have fewer mouths. We will have fewer rats for our stores. We will have citizens grateful for the absence of those who robbed them." Joffrey laughed delightedly. "Will they?" he said. "Grateful. They will fancy themselves grieved if it gives them something to say," she said. "But grief exhausts itself. Gratitude is the shape things fall into when they have no choice." She did not look at Tommen's face. She preferred to remember him as he had looked asleep, a piece of the past borrowed for a moment. She did not look because she still wanted to believe tomorrow might leave him untouched. It is the best lie most mothers tell themselves, and it fits the tongue without effort. Sansa in the cellar sat very straight because sitting straight is a way to make sure your heart keeps beating in order and does not climb into your throat. The dark was an old thing there. It had lived there longer than the keep. Sandor leaned against the door and made his breath go in and out as if the air needed to be told how to move. Somewhere far above them a long iron noise went on, and then the iron decided to cease being iron and became a story to tell about what happens when iron is fed too much heat. "Do you know a song?" Sandor asked suddenly, his voice like stone sliding. "Sing something good. Not that maiden's milk. Nothing about bluebirds. If there's a bluebird in it, I'll swallow my own hand." "I do not think I could sing," Sansa said, surprised into something that almost smiled. "Even if I were promised I would live if I did." "You're not promised," he said. "And you'll live whether you sing or don't. That's the trouble. You live and you have to carry it." He slid down to sit with his back to the door and closed his eyes. "Sing anyway. It'll make it easier to hear when the screaming stops." She considered his face and saw the places where it had tried to be a face and hadn't been allowed. She began on something low, not a bluebird, something a nurse had sung once when she was nothing but a small stomach and too many questions. Her voice trembled and then found itself. The dark listened and did not judge. The sounds from above like furniture dragged across heaven grew stranger. The air below their feet shuddered and the dust fell in a soft rain. Ancient dust that had meant to stay tucked into the corners of its stones and was irritated to be made to move now. The song steadied itself and traveled along the edges of the dark and came back to her softened, as if it had been worn smooth by the stone's hands. Outside, the city took lessons from the fire in how to become one thing. The green spread without hurry. It respected its own time. It found a cart of dried kindling prepared for a baker's oven and turned it into a teacher. It met a line of men carrying water and made a joke of their effort, and they did not understand the joke, and so they protested, and their protests made for more jokes. It reached the docks and lapped at the water with a lover's curiosity, and the water, which had believed itself to be what stops other things, flinched. A sloop at anchor put light on her mooring lines and then took too much into herself. A gull, offended, struck at a morsel floating in heat and discovered heat has teeth. Helene lifted both hands and closed his eyes like a priest delivering himself of his own words. The men at his sides watched him because watching a man who believes himself conducting the world feels like belonging to something larger. Janos Slint had long ago learned to interpret the weather of men's faces, and he saw that if Helene could, the man would have walked into the fire because he wanted to be closer to his marvel. Janos touched the seal at his chest again, not because it would help but because it brought him back to a place where the world made a sense he preferred. He shouted for order. He did not try to get it. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old bronze, and the sun had an embarrassed look, as if it had been caught peeking at a spectacle it should have censured. The Sept's great dome took on a sheen a woman's hair sometimes does at dusk. Then something within the shape relaxed, and the crown of it slipped, not so much falling as exhaling. One bell broke from its harness and fell, and its fall sounded like the end of a story. When it hit, the note it made went through the city like a hand through water. Everyone felt that note. Everyone stopped what they were doing for as long as it takes for a breath that has been forgotten to be remembered. In a tall house on Ragman's Lane, an old woman whose eyes were bad but whose hands could still find the right thread sat in her chair and said to no one, "This is what it is like when the gods look down." Varys found the woman with 3 children just as the blue-sailed ship raised anchor. He used a voice that belonged to kind uncles. He pressed the little ones through the gap in the railing, and then he and the woman had to take their turn as the ship moved, and he knew that if anything changed, they would miss it. He put his hand on the woman's back, and the woman turned and looked at him and realized he was soft, and that his softness came from places where softness is protected by cleverness. She stepped onto the plank and crossed. Varys's foot struck a barrel, and he turned his head and found himself looking at the city in profile, as if he were seeing a painting made by a hand that loved certain kinds of horror. He bowed his head briefly to the city the way one bows to something that taught you and destroyed you in equal measure. Cersei allowed herself to sit alone again for a moment when the worst of the first burning had passed and the city had begun to settle into its new shape of screaming. She sipped the wine now, and it tasted of what it was supposed to taste like. She thought of her father, and of a city he had entered once that had died in a day and lived on for 1,000 because of what had been done in that day. She thought of all the men who had broken her world and who had smiled while they did it, and of their soft, satisfied bellies, and how the gods had failed to strike them down. The gods were dull, she decided. Men must instruct them. She rose and went to her children. Joffrey wanted to go down to the yard to see the aftermath. Tommen wanted to hold his kitten in a pocket of his shirt. Myrcella wanted to know if there were people hurt and if something could be done and if doing something would help. Cersei took their wants and folded them away. "There will be quiet soon," she said. "There will be calm. There will be gratitude." "Will there?" Myrcella asked, not skeptical but genuinely inquiring. "From whom?" "From those who can count," Cersei said. "And those who cannot count do not matter." She took their hands one after the other, as if weighing them. She looked toward the window and did not open it. She did not need to see. She had already seen everything. The last of that day's light went while the last of the Sept's higher stones fell. The green dimmed in places and surged in others like a thing giving its own eulogy. Men sobbed because they had expected to be braver or because they were grateful to have the chance to sob. Women sat down on their heels and folded into themselves because people become smaller when the world becomes larger than what they thought it would be. Someone laughed too loud and could not stop laughing for a very long time, and when he did he had bitten through his lip. Sansa's song ended. She took a breath and began another because she did not know what else would keep her from speaking in her ordinary voice the words she did not want to hear herself say. Sandor opened his eyes and let the dark be what it was. He could not tell if the worst had passed because he had not known what would qualify. He felt a sweat on him that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with the memory of heat. "You can stop, little bird," he said at last. "You'll wear the song out. There's always more screaming to come." She looked at him, and it occurred to her that pity is not the opposite of disdain. Sometimes pity is simply another form of knowing. "Thank you," she said. She was surprised to realize she meant it. When they opened the door at last, the air that came in had gathered a new language. Spoke in Ash. Sandor listened and could understand a few words. They moved up the stair. The corridor above had soot drawn along it where the drafts had been. The light through a small high window was wrong in color. It had a green never meant for windows. Sansa stood very still and listened to the keep as if it were a person she could trust if she held very still. The keep was old and full of its own opinions. It told her only that it remained. The first accounts began with the dull mechanics of survival. Who had found whom, who had not been found, whose cousin knew a man who owed a favor to a baker with a tall son, and so a door had opened. Haleen counted jars and came up with a neat tally that would have satisfied a bookkeeper of an honest trade. He licked his lips with a dry tongue and found no moisture there. He wrote a letter in his head with all the correct flourishes and did not realize that when he put pen to paper his hand would shake and the letters would turn into the trembling of a leaf. Janos Slint walked the steps alone and pretended he was there to conduct his duty, and not because he had been told to withdraw and now needed to convince himself that retreat was forward. Varys sat silently in a room whose furnishings had chosen not to move during the calamity and thought about the thing he had seen in the Queen's face in the moment before she shut the shutters. A shape of belief that made him briefly cold. Cersei slept at last when the night was too heavy to resist. She slept as if sleep were also a form of command and could be compelled by a queen. In her sleep she dreamed of lions and not of fire, and in the dream the lions did not move but the ground did. And she found that all the movement in the world can come from not moving at all. When dawn slid into the wounds the night had made, the city woke not so much from sleep as from the forced contemplation of what it had become. Smoke still ranked in the low places. The great September was a shell and the bells looked indecent where they lay. The streets had learned new paths. A man who had lost his shop found he could still find his neighbor's voice in the air if he spoke his neighbor's name. Children gathered at the edge of the heat and were scolded and did not listen because every lesson has an opposite. News traveled the way news does in cities. In opinion disguised as fact, in facts disguised as bragging, in sobs disguised as threats. It arrived in the riverlands like a scent, in the north like a rumor that had been wrapped in fur. It traveled to a camp where a man with hair he never learned to comb touched a map and felt a new edge there, and to an island tower where a man, with fire in his thoughts, watched his red woman smile and believed smiling was victory. It moved to a tent where a king of green was eating a peach and found him less delighted by the taste. It made its way to a father who had given the world to himself long ago and thought of a city he had left unsacked in favor of being invited in later, and his mouth did not move and the men around him pretended not to notice he had not swallowed for longer than a man should not swallow. At noon in the Red Keep, the Queen took counsel. She sat in a chair that did not admit it was a throne and listened, and her face had the bored patience of someone hearing men describe a thing she had already done. It satisfied her. It made the day flow past her without being able to turn her. "We will send men," she said at last, "with bread and with water. We will send men with buckets to wet what is still sullen. We will reward those who bring us names. We will pay for names. There will be a new watch captain for the Street of Sisters and for the Market District. Remove the men who ran first," she added, her voice quiet because quiet is the tone of decisions that do not need to shout to be obeyed. "Set their purses on fire." Pycelle twitched and coughed his courtly cough. "May I, your grace, advise that the faith will require reassurance." Cersei looked at him with the lazy contempt of a cat watching a fly forget what wall it wanted. "The faith requires what I give it. It will be reassured, or it will be replaced." Janos Slint said nothing because he had discovered something in himself that morning, a limit he had not known and did not like. He stood straighter to hide it. Littlefinger smiled a curve for the sake of those who prefer their talent expressed gently. Varys folded his hands in the manner of men who are certain of nothing and wish to give nothing away. He was considering each of 100 threads, which one would pull clean, which would bring the cloth down. He did not yet suspect which he would soon have to pull, because he did not yet know which child would live or who would be willing to live differently. Sansa stepped into the yard as the day turned from ash to ordinary and made herself walk. The world always resumed its ordinary, she saw, it always insisted on it. The grooms laughed too loudly to prove they could laugh at all. A serving girl giggled because someone had said something truly funny. The world does not stop being funny simply because it has taken on a new shape of cruelty. Sansa stood in the light and let it find her. She thought of songs with green in them and found none. She thought of the Queen and of fire and how they had been combined and decided she would begin to write a song with no birds in it. She did not yet know what it would say. Sandor went to the stables and placed his hand on a horse's neck and found it hot. The horse's eye rolled at him in a motion that suggested it understood more than a horse should. He told himself he would leave when the city stopped moving. The trouble was, cities always move. He poured wine and it did not make him feel any closer to sanity. He could still smell the green wherever he went. He would be smelling it the rest of his life. In the ruined markets, men picked at what had been saved. A boy found a fish whose flesh had taken on a surprising taste and ate it anyway and did not die. Two women sat and held hands because they did not have enough strength to do anything except share it. A man in a faded cloak put a hand on a stone and felt it warm and pulled the hand away because he did not want to be warmed by it. He looked toward the keep and saw a thin set of windows and imagined a queen there who had done this, and he felt something, admiration or hatred or both, and walked away, because feeling was not useful to him and he had learned the utility of feelings too well. By evening, the green had gone from the light, or the eye had simply adjusted. The city counted itself and found itself different. The queen sent buckets and bread and men with lists, and everywhere she sent them the people obeyed because they had fewer choices now. The faith sent ravens to itself. The ravens returned with slogans. None of the slogans helped the people whose walls were gone. The Sept's ruin stood like a mouth that had been broken and had decided to remain a mouth regardless. A new smell rose in the night like a penitent. Cersei stood again at the shutters and opened them and let the night come into the room as a guest. Felt polite. She put her hands on the sill and the stone was still warm. She stood there until the warmth went into her, and then the stone cooled and she wasn't sure whether it had wanted to give her its heat or whether she had taken it. She did not care. She had done a thing. It would have consequences. Men would call it madness, and men would call it ruthlessness, and men would call it brave depending on what they wanted from her. She thought of her father's stillness, of her brother's laugh which had always been for her alone and for nobody else. She thought of her children's heads under her hands. She thought of the woods witch's tent and the smell of it, like old blood and cheap wine. She closed the shutters gently and turned to the room which had not left her. Her shadow moved on the wall, and for a moment it was the shape of a girl playing at being a queen, and then it was the shape of a woman who had been queen so long that the game and the truth were the same. In the streets below, a man sat with his back against a half-warm stone and watched his own breath, because it was the only thing he owned no one could take. A woman coaxed 3 girls to sleep with lies she made up on the spot, good lies, comforting lies, about how the green is a dragon that came and went and will not come again. A boy who had thought himself destined for glory because boys always do stood with his ankle in a hole and could not get it loose, and he cried why. Without shame until someone came and pulled him free, and then he felt ashamed anyway for needing to be pulled free, and so he wiped his face and stole a sausage because stealing felt like movement. 2 men argued about whether it had been the queen's plan or a god's punishment or the old king returning. They fought until one of them laughed, and then they laughed and did not know why, and then one of them sobbed into the laughter and the other put a hand on his shoulder so he would know he had not become a ghost. The city did not sleep. It rolled itself onto a new side and groaned. It listened to its own heart beating under the stones and decided to keep beating. If a city can decide, it did. If it cannot, then it did anyway, because sometimes things continue not because they have decided to but because they must. Varys stood in a room without windows and lit a single candle and arranged its light on his hands the way a man arranges coins to count them. He whispered the names he knew of the living and the names he knew of the dead and left space for those he did not know yet. He had never liked space he could not fill. He looked down into the flame, and it seemed to him to have a color at its heart that did not belong there, and he blew it out and sat in the dark and found the dark preferable because in the dark a man imagines particulars he can control. Helene returned to his guild's hall and wrote the first words of his letter in a hand that had dressed suits of fireworks for noble weddings and now had done something he thought larger than any wedding. "Honored brothers," he wrote, and then paused and then wrote. Today the city returned to itself, and thought himself clever, and did not think of the parts of the city that had learned they were less themselves now, or of those who had been told by flame that they were not part of the city at all. Janos Slint walked the wall and told himself that what mattered was that he was on the wall and not below it. He made a list in his head of names that could be thrown to the queen if she asked why certain things had happened. He made room on the list for anyone who looked at him in a way that made him uncomfortable. Littlefinger counted the losses and the opportunities with the same neat internal abacus. He found himself smiling at a thought he didn't have to share. How quickly men will price a life once the first numbers have been spoken aloud. Sandor lay on his back staring at the roof and decided that if the queen asked him to walk into green he would refuse, and if she put a blade to his throat he would bite it and it would taste of its oil. He understood for a moment that he had already left the city even if his body had not moved yet. He slept, and his sleep was a hard plank. Sansa climbed to the highest place she was allowed and looked toward the city that had been given a new name in her heart and not a kind one. She stood there until her legs told her to stop, because pain is a form of belonging. She did not speak aloud. She thought about the north and the smell of the north, which is not simple but at least it is honest in its complicity. She did not imagine a rescue. She did not imagine a prince. She imagined a road. She imagined a door. She imagined her own hand turning its latch. Cersei sat at her dressing table at last and took the pins from her hair. One by one. Each little click was a precise choice. Her hair fell and she let it fall. She looked at herself in the mirror without the lies of gold and saw the woman who had set a city alight and decided she was the sort of woman she had always believed herself to be, and therefore there was nothing to be done now except continue to be her. She smiled at herself because there was nobody else she trusted to deserve the smile. The night looked in from the shutters as if waiting. She did not give it anything. From the river the burned air rose and carried with it all the stories that had begun that day. The current took them down toward the bay where ships waited to leave who had not decided yesterday to leave, and then out, where the green had become a rumor already and men were rehearsing what they would say about it when they came to the next port. The city sat back on its haunches and blinked and then opened its eyes all the way. Lovers went to ground together not because they had been reminded of death but because they had been reminded of their bodies. Priests counted their surviving loaves. Thieves counted the survivors' coins. The watch made double circuits to show it existed, and merchants spoke in new numbers and pretended the numbers were fair because being fair is a matter of display. In the morning after that morning, the queen would call for names and men would bring them on paper and in whispers and in crude bargains, and a different sort of fire would begin. The city had become an instruction. It would be cited in letters and shouted in camps. It would find its way to a woman across the sea whose dragons were still small enough to be held and make her lift her face as if someone had spoken her name. It would find its way to a rock thrown by the shore where a man with salt in his beard would look at the green in his mind and consider the shape of ambition. It would make a rumor in a rough place where wolves did not know whose boys they were. It would travel, in short, the way fire travels, hungry and eager to be itself wherever it found purchase. But for now, the queen slept, and the city did not, and the men who woke in its streets woke wrong and would go the rest of their lives trying to adjust their faces to the new shape. A widow in Flea Bottom tore a length from a singed sheet and used it to bind her daughter's foot and told her that all Sauls toughen if asked politely enough. A cook cleared ash from a pan and taught himself to use less wood and more patience. A child who had laughed at the puppet burning would years later remember the color and not the laughed, and would call the color a kind of god. Sandor woke with his hand on his sword as if it had crawled there in the night. Sansa woke and did not cry until she had put on her dress because she knew how long it took to dry tears and she could not afford the time. Varys woke in a chair and did not move until he had rearranged the map of things in his head and found a place for every new line. Helene woke and wrote. Cersei woke, and the room greeted her like a courtier. She rose and looked in the mirror and told herself she saw a queen. She did not know yet what other people would see, and it did not matter. She called for her maids and her dress and her ring. She called for her children and their faces. She called for the day. The day came. It had not forgiven her. Days never do. It did as it was ordered. It moved forward. She moved with it. The red keep held its breath and then let it out slowly. The green had left a stain on the air, and the stain would not go. The city started the business of living again because living was a business and everybody owed. The queen stepped into the hall. Somebody somewhere began to ring a bell that had survived. The note wandered and then found a path and then walked it. Everything that had not yet happened was waiting not far off. The ruins did not implode. They endured. Children found new games to play among them. Men found new places to stand and pretend they were important. The sky sat sullen and made plans for a real storm when it was bored again. Cersei walked to the edge of her world and stood looking down. She could have convinced herself that what had been done had already been absorbed into the scheme of things. She did not bother to convince herself. She understood too well that what matters most is not one day, but the way the day leaves its mark on those that follow. She lifted her chin. She breathed in the ruined air. Somewhere a gull cried the same laugh it always cried, because gulls are indifferent to kings and queens and cities and their appetites. "We will be obeyed," Cersei said, and the stone heard her, and the stone was an old listener and made no sound. And yet, in what followed, the city behaved as if it had nodded.